Lisa Brennan-Jobs, you've written a memoir with all its personality and details and peculiarity, and it's not to be mistaken for a biography of Steve Jobs. And yet, he's your father, and is very much at the center of the book, as are you. And I want to start at the beginning of things and have you read from the beginning of the book, if you would.
3 months before he died, I began to steal things from my father's house. I wandered around barefoot and slipped objects into my pockets. I took blush, toothpaste, 2 chipped finger bowls in Celadon blue, a bottle of nail polish, a pair of worn patent leather ballet slippers, and 4 faded white pillowcases, the color of old teeth. After stealing each item, I felt sated. I promised myself that this would be the last time. But soon, the urge to take something else would arrive again, like thirst.
Now, in your book, Steve Jobs is the father, often the missing father, the father that rejects you for a long time. Much later, it invites you in. There are moments of real cruelty. But you begin this book in the way that you do. Why?
I guess it makes me an active participant in the book. One thing that happened when I started writing is I was disappearing in the pages. I was writing about my parents and different things that had happened, and I couldn't, other people who read it said, I can't quite locate you. At some point I read This Boy's Life again.
This is Tobias Wolff's memoir.
Yeah. And I realized that every time he was devious, I loved him more. The worse he was, the more I adored him. So with that license, or with that new idea, I found a new freedom to try and figure out where I had participated in my own life, and more, where I'd been kind of bad. You know?
Well, what is the most daunting aspect of setting out to write this book in your 30s? Your father occupies a space in the popular imagination of a creator giant. You walk down the street and you see iPhone after iPhone after iPhone. Over there's an iMac. It's everywhere. There's no escaping it. And yet your vantage point is entirely different. How do you process that in literary terms as a part of a book?
I wanted to write this book, and even though, despite the fact that there's this really famous person in my family, I wanted to write a coming-of-age story about a girl growing up in California in the 80s and 90s, because I felt like if I got into it enough, if I got deep enough into it, it was a universal story.
When you read somebody else's memoir who's in their late 30s, and they're talking about when they were 6 or 7, no matter, how do we understand that as opposed to, journalism or biography or scholarship? How do we read that?
I feel like it's quite true. I keep on getting notes from people who are in the book saying, "Oh my God, this is completely accurate." But I felt for a long time, and I think that a lot of people can come out with their first book and it has a lot of issues with it, a lot of problems, a lot of flaws, maybe. And I felt that this one, to some degree, I had to be, it had to be less impeachable, so that it would be worthy of the extra attention.
Particularly in the first half of the book, there's a great deal of cruelty. Some of it mindless, some of it you ascribe to immaturity on his part, but it's painful to read. What was that like to re-experience every day over your desk?
You have this thing with memoir where you're going back and you're writing about it again, and you're pulled back into these feelings and these times in order to write about them. But on the other side, at the end of the day, I got to put down the pen and then go back to my life. So I got to be, it's like the fantasy of control, right? I got to
mastery of the past.
Right. So I got to go back and live in the past and elongate the good moments and maybe even elongate the bad moments to really figure out what they meant to me and suffer through them, but I still had control over them. And I had perspective control. I could see them from the point of view of an adult and a child. I was no longer just the child.
Multiple perspectives
Yeah.
all at once.
And I talk about that with my mother in the car. I think I'm 3 or 4. And my mother, who has read the article in Time magazine that says my father kind of said she'd slept around, so who knows if he's the father.
Yeah.
And she'd read this article and it had been devastating, and we had no money, and we're going back and it's raining, and she's getting lost, and she started screaming, not at me, but kind of at the world. And she's screaming, and she slams the dash, and it was terrifying, you know. And
you remember this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember it, and I remember her, her feeling of hopelessness. And her rage was terrifying. And then I write about this in the book in one of these, you know, sort of spiritual moments I wasn't sure whether to put in, where I felt as if there was, even at the time, there was a presence in the back of the car, kind of with us, a good presence that couldn't interfere. In some ways,
the presence of your father.
No, the presence of me writing the book. Like,
I see.
That has been the feeling of going back and writing about childhood. Like I get to go back and keep myself company. I can't interfere, but I'm a benevolent presence that then gets to keep this girl company as she travels all these, and gets to say, it's gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay.
After your book was published, Laureen Powell-Jobs, his widow, your stepmother, and Mona Simpson, your aunt, who herself is a very good novelist, issued a statement saying, it's worded very carefully, but I'll summarize it. Essentially, we saw the past very differently, which only stands to reason, but clearly distanced themselves from your book in a very distinct way. And they clearly were not happy about the book. What do you think is at the center of their unhappiness of the book, and how do you interpret their statement and criticism of it?
I think people have been writing about me a long time. And so I know what it feels like to have a sort of a slice of your life represented by someone else. And I know that it doesn't always feel very good. So that was part of my trepidation in writing a book. Why did I have a right? Why did I have a right?
You have to give yourself permission.
Yeah, but what I decided is that I did have the right to write my own story as accurately and as beautifully and as full of complexity as I could. I had that right. I decided, you know, other people might feel differently.
You have any relationship with Mona Simpson or Laureen Powell-Jobs at this point?
Oh, yeah, I mean, I care about them, and we'll see how Thanksgiving is.
How is it usually?
It's pretty good.
It is, okay. So the Steve Jobs that comes out of popular imagination, you get the sense of a visionary, a certain kind of genius, a really difficult guy, at times cruel, self-centered.
The way that you just read he came off was from the other things that you read, not
Absolutely.
from my book.
Absolutely.
So, and I'm curious to know, I'm curious to know from you, how was it different in my book, the way that he came off, than from these other things?
Quite radically different, but mostly I'm seeing it through you.
Right, I thought so too.
Talk about you.
Yeah, and how does he come off differently?
Well, there are moments where I want to hit him.
More than before.
Well, because it's coming from a kid who's palpable on the page.
Right, because you can feel the feelings more.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, it's not necessarily a different character that I'm describing. It's just that it's visceral now.
I think that's fair.
I've tried to understand why this reaction has been strong, because I feel like he's been so well covered. It's like, and that there are moments of joy, tenderness, sweetness, care in this book between the two of us that are nowhere else, right?
Well, maybe it's because people feel a certain sense of, it's very strange to me in a certain way, relationship and ownership to this guy who's now been dead for a while.
Yeah.
Because he's in their pockets.
Right.
He's on their desks. Maybe you should tell us about what happened when he was very sick.
We kind of had a Hollywood moment, which I didn't have the guts to hope for, or the audacity to hope for.
Tell us what happened. Where, when, how?
I went back to see him before he died, and he was apologizing fiercely for a weekend and crying, and saying, "I owe you one," which seemed like such an odd phrase.
What does
and
I owe you one mean?
I don't know. I didn't know how to make sense of it, really.
Yeah.
And the way that I made sense of it at the time, and I think it was both on my part a kindness, a sweetness, which I really meant, and a way to sort of underscore my frustration, that I said to him, if we could do it again, if there are multiple lifetimes, and obviously we do not know, then maybe next time we could be friends. And what I meant was we were good as friends because we liked each other. We would laugh together. It was fun when we were friends.
Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.